Welcome to TriloTalk. This is a podcast dedicated to topics that we think are important to the profession of medical writing. And our goal is to bring topical issues to the forefront and hopefully spark conversations in the wider domain about these issues.
I am Dr. Barry Dries, Senior Partner at Trilogy Writing, and I am here today with Maria Mascarenhas, which I probably just mangled in the pronunciation. I apologize. My Portuguese is a little weak. And she is Senior Medical Writing Manager and located actually in Portugal. And we are going to be talking about today the briefing book. So welcome, Maria. And maybe would you like to tell me how I should have pronounced your name?
Thank you, Barry. It's Mascarenhas, but it's okay.
There you go.
No one can ever pronounce it.
Okay, so let's get started with, I think, the obvious thing. We're going to talk about briefing books. Why don't you tell us what is a briefing book and why are they important in the process of drug development?
Well, if any sponsor wants to obtain an authorization, a marketing application from any particular region, they need advice and guidance from the regulatory health authority of that particular region. And getting advice and guidance usually means meeting with those authorities. And briefing documents or briefing books or briefing packs, however you want to call them, are just the document that support these interactions with the authorities. And they're really quite important because these meetings with the authorities shape the development and the future of your product in that region. So it's really very important and very critical that you have a well-written briefing document to facilitate these discussions.
Okay, as I sit here and listen to that, I think, couldn't I just give them an investigator brochure? What is special about a briefing book or document that separates it from a fair amount of the other kind of documents we work on?
That's a fair question. So you have to think about that you're going to ask specific questions to these regulatory authorities, and you have to provide just enough information that they're able to answer your question. So you're really trying to shape and mold your clinical development plan, and you need their input, but it has to be about specific topics. So that's the difference. In an investigator brochure, you just write pretty much what has happened throughout the entire development of your product. But here you're going to ask specific questions at different stages of development. So that would be the major difference.
Okay, good. Nicely put. I am playing the interviewer, as you can hear, but of course I've written a few briefing books and have a few ideas of my own and a few thoughts of my own, which I will add. And I would add here that I totally agree. It's the questions that really make a briefing book different because you want to ask them some things. And there are some things you need to be careful about. We will get to this a little bit later about how to ask questions. Because as any scientific poll taker will tell you, the way you ask questions plays a huge role in what kind of answer you give. And you can completely flip the way the public answer questions by changing how you ask them. So let's start with some of the obvious stuff. You do these briefing books for meetings with both the US FDA and also the European EMA, European Medicines Agency. What are there any differences? Are they very similar? What is your experience and thoughts on that?
Well, they're pretty similar between the two. There's actually a lot of overlap between the type of meetings you can request for these authorities. It's really the meeting type terminology that changes, but you'd still ask at much of the same stages. So, for example, at your end of phase 2, you'd ask for a Type B end of phase 2 meeting with the FDA. Same thing for EMA. EU pre-submission meeting just means FDA Type B pre-NDA meeting, but it's at the same stage and you'd probably ask reasonably similar questions. So there's actually not a lot of difference.
What would you say, though, about the tone? Because I know that the tone can change quite a bit between submissions to the FDA and Europe. In terms of how they react and how you should maybe pitch your briefing book. Do you think there's much difference there, or is the biggest difference where you are in the drug development and or indication or something like that?
No, I mean, you can repurpose a lot of the briefing document between regions, but the way you set the stage can be slightly different. With EMA, I think you have to take them more on a tour if you agree, and kind of set out a lot of the explanation up front. With the FDA, I say you have to be briefer and more straight to the point. And they'll have, but both of them will have pretty strong opinions, and you can repurpose between the two if you intend on asking similar questions.
I would definitely say it's good to get straight to the point with both.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, there's this myth that FDA is all, cold and scientific, and they do this analysis, whereas the EMA, but I've actually not found that to be the case in my experiences. Where the biggest difference, and I don't have a lot of experience with this in briefing books, but is when you're doing just a Me-8 drug versus a truly new innovative therapy, and even more so if you're doing an orphan indication. And I think both groups of authorities understand that when you're doing an orphan indication, you are not doing it to make big money, because by its definition, an orphan indication, for any listeners who aren't sure what that is, it's something in a very rare disease. I'm not sure where the limit is in number of potential patients, what determines an orphan, but usually it's a few hundred to maybe a few thousand, as opposed to diabetes, which is obviously millions, maybe even billions. And certainly the authorities are much more sympathetic and friendly when you're doing an orphan indication, like I said. And I think the reason for that is they understand you're not making a lot of money, so they are much more sympathetic, whereas they tend to be more skeptical and, yeah, maybe even aggressive if you're doing something that's going to have a huge market.
And have you found there's a difference then between EMA and FDA approaching this? Because that was in terms of tone as
not really.
Original question.
I know
they are
one
pretty
thing that
similar,
maybe
right?
has shaded this discussion is that FDA, for some bizarre political reason, is actually a branch of the Navy. And so when they audit a company, and I've been in American companies where the FDA came for an audit, and they all show up in naval uniforms, and you're like,
really
good Lord, what is this? But I haven't really seen that much. And as soon as it's orphaned, both Europeans and Americans are just much more cooperative and friendly. I used to make a standard joke where they invite you to sit down and have milk and cookies, whereas otherwise it's kind of, they stand there and scowl at you. Okay, before we then talk some more about how do you interact, I think an obvious question that everyone asks is, like for many of the documents we work in, like a CSR where you have ICH and Transcelerate templates and stuff like that, are there any templates and or guidance, and how detailed are those?
There's actually not a lot of guidance or training for preparing briefing documents themselves. So both FDA and EMA have guidance on the meetings themselves, but then only the EMA actually provides a template for the briefing document. So there isn't really a lot of information.
How detailed is that template? Is it because, I know that the ICH template for protocols is little more than sort of a table of contents, whereas the ICH template for the CSR is really detailed. Which direction of that would you describe the EMA template?
I would say it's closer to the protocol. You do have a table of contents, and there is some information of what you could write between in each section, but that's pretty much it. It doesn't really give you a lot of advice on the strategic side of how these documents should be written, which is the really hard part of a briefing document, right? It's an incredibly strategic document. There's not really advice on how to do that.
Okay, well then you're leading to the next topic. So, and we'll both probably chime in on this. What are your thoughts on what are probably the most important strategic considerations when you're working on a document like this?
I mean, we've mentioned it before. Questions are really the most important thing for a briefing document, and where you really need to spend your time crafting these questions. And also the entire briefing document really centers around it, right? So you have to write sponsors' positions for these questions. All your background sections are really based mostly on what questions you're asking. So that's I find that's really the most crucial aspect of a briefing document. All other sections really truly depend on these.
I
That.
completely agree with you and have some thought. I mean, one thing that's for sure is if you start writing a briefing book, as I mentioned earlier with the investigative brochure, until you get the questions, it isn't that much different from something like an investigative brochure because you're doing the background and where the development is and so on. When you get to the questions, though, the biggest challenge in terms of writing a briefing book, I find for a writer is getting the questions because the sponsor has to work closely with their regulatory folks and say, okay, what do we actually want to ask? And then, as we already noted a bit, it's very important how you ask questions. I always tell a standard anecdote. You never want to ask EMA or FDA, should we do more studies? Because obviously they're going to say, yes, we always like lots of studies. Do as many as you possibly can. What you want to do is phrase it more along the lines of, we believe these studies are sufficient to support the application and approval of this drug in the following indication. Does the agency agree? That way they kind of say yes or no, and you're going to get a much more positive reaction usually than should we do more studies. So if you're working with a very inexperienced team, like in a biotech company or something, you do want to suggest they go in that much more, give me a yes or no answer question than just tell me anything.
No, absolutely. You want to channel the authorities towards the response you want to get, right? So that's really important. And honestly, the EMA template or the CHMP template even puts it that way. You have a position, and does the agency agree with that position? That's how they say we should structure our sections. We should follow the same for the FDA, really, which really tells you they also agree that they're looking for a much more straightforward answer. Let's put it that way. So your questions really need to be unambiguous as well. It needs to be very clear what you want out of those questions, if that makes sense.
And make it positive, as I suggested. Does the agency agree that the studies we are recommending are sufficient, rather than saying, do you think these are enough studies? Try and do it saying this is, basically what we think. Do you agree, or are there potentially issues that you have with that? Another big thing is the number of questions. And sometimes your meetings are very limited in time. And so I find not only the number of questions is something that I try to and get the whole team active, involved in discussing, but also the order. Because sometimes you'll have two really important questions, and then you have some other questions that are kind of eh. And so I always try to put the questions at the end, because time is tight, and sometimes it'll lead to a big discussion, and then you just won't get to some of those other questions. And
yeah, very true. And that has to be part of the strategy as well. When you think about which ones would be more important for you to ask and more important for you to get an answer from the authorities. It's not that you won't get written feedback for other questions, but do be aware there's only a limited amount of time you actually have with those authorities and with that panel to discuss with them. So I agree with you. It's very important. And there's certain structures, right? There's certain ways you have to order your questions by discipline, and the CHMP template does that. That doesn't mean you can't skip to an area that is more of interest to you to have a discussion on site with the team.
And I suppose based on what we've just said, it should be painfully obvious, but you'd be surprised how often things that are painfully obvious are not adhered to. And that is, you need to focus really on the principles of lean medical writing and telling a story. As we at Trilogy like to say, it's story, not storage, and dissuade your client from just putting everything in the kitchen sink in there. Try to focus exactly on what you want to ask, and then what is your justification for that. And I always encourage people to say, if you have a short question and just a short amount of information, you can do it just that way. But if you have anything more than a page, try to do an executive summary.
Oh,
because
absolutely.
I will absolutely promise you there will be reviewers who that if it's more than a page, they ain't going to read it. So you want to make sure that you really have a tightly argued and put together position for them to be able to grasp it as quickly as possible.
And you can use subheadings and everything to break and to make it a lot easier as well. But I agree with you, an executive summary at the end that kind of guides the reader through what you're going to say after is really important. Absolutely.
And it's kind of interesting because this really does bring in a whole bunch of basic principles of medical writing. One principle that I always teach is many medical writing documents have the problem of they need to be complete, but they also need to be readable. And how do you make something both of those things? And many people just say, well, I just throw everything I can in there. That doesn't make it readable. So my solution to that is what I call hierarchy. Good subheadings, as you just mentioned, but also tables of contents and links and things like that. You can have appendices if you want to put all kinds of data in there. Don't toss it into the middle of the question, but put links and so on. And I think that enables, using navigational aids to move around to appendices and other documents is a really important thing in a briefing book. Even more so in some of the other documents, although I would argue it's probably a good idea everywhere.
Very true. But if you don't do it for other documents, at least do it for the briefing document. And the guidance itself, it should be brief. It's not an exhaustive presentation of everything that's ever happened with your drug. It's just enough information for them to be able to provide you a clear answer. That's what you need. So when it's a summary about a study, it really is a summary that you have to provide about your study.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question that I'm curious about. And I'm not even sure what you're going to answer, but that's what makes it fun. When I interview new people for a job at Trilogy, I often ask them, what's your favorite document to write and what's your least favorite document to write? So on that scale, with 0 being least favorite and 10 being most favorite, where would you put the briefing book?
Oh, that's my favorite to write. It's no accident.
Okay,
I'm here talking
can you
to
tell me
you
why?
right now. I think, well, first, because it is the document where you have to be the leanest, I think, in terms of medical writing. It is very strategic, and no one briefing document is not ever like the other, even for the same drug, right? As you move along the development plan, and I've had the luck to write briefing documents along that, it just changes every time. I really like to see the strategy behind it, to have those discussions with our regulatory colleagues to figure out what's the best way to position a question. So I kind of really like that, just that strategic side. So that makes them my favorite. I'm not sure if you want to hear my least favorite, but
no, I would not at the
my
moment.
favorite is definitely the briefing doc.
Maybe we'll have another podcast on documents we hate writing. I agree with you that I don't know if it's absolutely my favorite, because I really enjoy doing CDDs and clinical overviews as well.
So do I. That would be my second,
but
my
I
favorite.
Definitely agree with you. And one of the reasons is similar to that for the CDD, and that is it's very high level. And I always tell people, why would you want to play in a friendly match between two countries when you could play at the final in the World Cup? That's what you want to do. And this is, not quite maybe as important as the clinical overview, but very close, because you're asking questions. This is going to determine how this drug gets developed and what the chances are that it will get approved. So that I love. And I just can't believe there'd be anyone who'd say, no, I want to do the little unimportant stuff. No, you want to do the important stuff. That's what's exciting. And
exactly, that's what's fun.
Yeah, I love the idea of telling stories, and in briefing documents, you're definitely telling a story and trying to get, those lean principles forward. So yes, I can see that we clearly agree on that. Yeah. Have you ever, what do you think was the biggest challenge you ever faced on a briefing book project?
Honestly, it's something that, well, I think the biggest challenge in common would be getting the questions right.
I was just thinking, obviously, Barry, the answer to this is getting the questions, but let's see what Maria says.
We've just been saying throughout the whole podcast, it's the most important thing is your questions. Everything revolves around the questions you ask. So I think that's always the hardest to pin down, is the questions.
I agree.
Which obviously then affects everything else. So
no, and I totally agree. And it's kind of like, the documents I like to write the least, I'm not going to go into them, but it's because they don't provide me the things I need to write a good document. And the one big hurdle with briefing books is getting them to give you the questions and decide what the questions actually are. I have started many briefing book projects in my time where we started writing and we had no questions.
Yeah,
and then there's this constant email thing. Any chance of getting the questions? Well, we're still talking about, and that can be challenging and frustrating. So I would totally agree with that. The other thing is that I would add to that is, as you mentioned earlier, there are different groups that have questions. So you might have non-clinical and and then getting them to think realistically about their questions and what we really want the authorities to answer is tough. Because there's this temptation, well, if we're talking FDA, let's ask them if they'd like us to do a triple, third tertiary, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, no, we don't want to ask that. That's crazy. We want to ask important things. And that can be very challenging, getting the people to.
Absolutely. And even when you get the list of questions, a lot of times you're then writing the sponsored position and you realized, oh, maybe the question needs to be filtered in a different way or needs to be changed. So I've had that as well, where the list of questions wasn't completely final and where you had to work with them to kind of finalize everything and to shape it even further. So
well, that I kind of expect, because they're not good at that. They're clinical researchers. So that the art of really posing a question and making it ask what you really want can be something they're not used to. And I kind of expect that. So I don't expect them to come in with beautifully polished questions that I just have to cut and paste.
Oh, no, of course not.
But I want them to at least tell me, what do they want to ask? And that is sometimes very difficult to get them to really focus and to decide. And often there's a lot of meetings, including key opinion leaders and blah, 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 where you have to kind of hash this out. And I often end up being kind of the bad boy in the back saying, that's way too long. Do you really want to ask that? Maybe we should try and rethink it. But it's a process, and I do enjoy that process, to be honest.
I just wanted our listeners to know that even when you do get a list of questions, the work doesn't stop, and the crafting and the polishing of the questions doesn't stop. So
strategically, if they send you 20 questions, boy, that's an awful lot. Are you going to have really time to address all those? And then even if they insist, yes, then, okay, which ones come first? This is something I teach in my review process workshop, where always look at the comments after review, because sometimes you'll have a comment that says, we can delete that whole section. Well, you better ask that first before we go through and address all the comments in the section, because if we're going to delete it, then we don't need all that. And that's the kind of thing that you have to look at these questions and say, are these truly separate questions, or are some of them dependent on the earlier ones? Then those have to be the first ones we ask. Cool. We're getting close to our time here, so I'm going to just leave the last part up to you. Is there anything you'd like to share with us that we haven't touched on about briefing books so far?
Sure. I think risk planning for a briefing document. Now, you find that obviously regulatory affairs colleagues will do a lot of this, but it's important when you're helping them polish the questions, when you're helping craft the position, that you think about these things as well. For example, the impact of an unwanted answer on the development goals. Like you've mentioned before, an authority would always agree to a question about whether they should conduct additional studies. So that's the kind of thing you need to think about if you get an answer you might not want. That's important when actually writing it. And also that different authorities might give you different feedback or disparate feedback, especially if you're going at the same time, which happens a lot to, say, FDA and EMA. With similar questions, you might actually get a different answer.
That's a good point. And, there are consequences, and not in this case that I'm going to give you so much on the briefing book, but I've known marketing people to say, okay, the drug didn't do much in the general population, but look at this tiny subgroup. It looks great there. And I say, be careful. The consequences of saying that to the authorities is they're going to say, interesting, go and do a study in that population. So I like the way you pitch that, is that when you're thinking of questions, you need to always consider the consequences of the answers you might get. However, don't give in to some people who say, oh, we don't dare ask that. What if they say X? Well, you better find out now than once you've submitted. So, I think Very important to have that conversation and to make sure everybody understands what are the potential consequences of doing this. I have heard rumors that there might be some fairly recent changes or current information on the guidelines. I'm going to confess, I don't really know about that. Can you enlighten us a bit on this?
Yes, so the CHMP has new guidelines and a template update for the briefing document. We'll focus on the briefing document template, I think. Honestly, it's just they've reorganized it a lot. So you now have, it's the same content with maybe they now detail a few more things you should add, but honestly, it's things that you already should have added before. It's just they organize it in a different way now and are more clear with their sections and subsections. But it's still everything that you would have included before, you still should include now. It's just organized differently. And they also now have these blue boxes, which is for their use, which you have to keep in and you can't delete. And if you use your own template, if you're a sponsor that uses their own template, you will obviously have to reorganize your template, put these blue boxes in. But that should be pretty much it. Everything you already did for a briefing document for EMA, you will still be doing now.
Okay, cool. So it sounds, if I may summarize that, as nothing really has changed in terms of the content, but they've cleaned it up a little bit and made it a bit more straightforward and given you maybe a little bit more guidance.
Correct. Yeah. So it's the flow now that you may have to consider might be slightly different, but still pretty similar.
Cool. Well, gosh, talking about this for a little while makes me want to run out and write another briefing book. But yeah, then I'm just going to say thank you, Maria, for joining me. I certainly enjoyed it, and I hope our listeners did as well. And I'll just wrap things up then with thank you for listening to TriloTalk today. If you enjoyed it, please come back and listen to us again. If you have feedback on these or any of our sessions, we would love to hear about it. In addition, if you have ideas for future topics that you would like us to cover, particularly something that you think the community should be talking about, let us know. We would like this to be an ongoing conversation with medical writers at large and also non-medical writers. We've mentioned regulatory people at several stages. If you have thoughts or things you'd like to add, things you wish every medical writer who is working on a briefing book with you should know, get in touch. You can send us comments on our Twitter feed or on our LinkedIn page. Just a reminder, you can find all episodes of the TriloTalk podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and at www.trilogywriting.com/TriloTalk. Sounds like pillow talk. Have a good rest of your day, and thanks again for joining us.